So this is our free reading group, continuing our reading of Neofinalism. We're picking up from the beginning of chapter 4, that's page 23 of the translation. So the previous chapter that we finished last time was essentially a criticism of anti-finalist positions in biology. So these are positions that deny that there is such a thing as teleology or goal-directedness in biological organisms, living beings. And this is, the whole concept of teleology has been a very controversial one in biology for the past, 150 years or so. So in part, this has to do with the fact that some sort of teleological language seems to be more or less indispensable in biology, that it's almost impossible to talk about organisms without talking about functions of, say, like an organ of that organism, or what this hormone does, what the function of the hormone is, or something like that. And a function, of course, is a teleological concept. You're saying that this hormone is for this function, whatever it is. But then, of course, this sort of runs against the whole mechanistic or generally anti-teleological orientation of, say, post-Galilean physics or natural science. And so this is like sort of the major break with Aristotelian or scholasticist science that happens sort of around Galileo, Descartes, people like that, has to do with the rejection of final causes. This is one of the sort of central components of that transition. And so, instead of saying that, heavy objects fall because the sort of natural place of those objects is near the center of the universe, that they have the sort of goal-directedness, instead you develop a theory of motion of bodies and gravitational attraction and so on that doesn't make any appeal to final causes. And so there's a lot of skepticism or suspicion of anything relating to final causes in any kind of natural science. But then at the same time, this sort of indispensability of final causes in biology. And so there's various ways of trying to get around this or overcome this problem that have been proposed. And one of probably the sort of default one among biologists today would be to say that we can reduce final causes or function or teleological language in biology to evolutionary terms. So when we say that a heart is for pumping blood, that just means that organisms that had hearts were better able to survive and reproduce as a result of having better blood circulation or whatever, something along those lines. That's obviously an oversimplification, but so essentially the teleology would just be in the eye of the beholder. So it's we as observers of organisms understand the way that they work in these teleological terms, but at the sort of fundamental level, that teleology is just a sort of reflection in our minds of the real evolutionary explanation. And so Ruyer doesn't exactly deal with that sort of evolutionary side of things in that chapter that we just finished, but he's criticizing some of the the various ways that people have tried to sort of explain away teleology in biological organisms. And one of the ways he does this is by sort of presenting biological functioning as sort of continuous with human technological creation, which is clearly teleological. So like even in the basic cases of like cooking, when you cook food, you are sort of pre-digesting it outside your body using various technological apparatus, even something as simple as making a fire. You're sort of doing some of the same chemical and other transformations of these substances outside your body as would be done in your body, but just by doing it outside your body, you're sort of making the job easier for your body. So you think of like eating raw potatoes or something, this would be rather difficult to digest, but then if you boil them or whatever, it's much easier. So if we take the sort of external digestion, boiling the potatoes as a kind of teleological process. A person, boiling potatoes isn't something that people just do by accident or like driven by some external force. It's something that, you decide that, I want to eat potatoes. I'm going to fill the pot with water, put it on top of the fire, whatever. All these steps are done for the sake of this end. And so if this is a teleological process, then and if it's analogous in nature to the biological process of digestion or continuous with that process, then it's hard to see why we should sort of draw this like strict separation between the external side is teleological and the internal side is not teleological. It seems to be sort of an unprincipled distinction to draw that line. And so this is sort of like the general, I guess, pattern of the arguments in that chapter is just that when we sort of treat living beings as machines, we can't really ignore the fact that machines are produced for a purpose. And so, of course, he's not arguing for something like intelligent design or creationism or something like that, saying that there was some conscious, intelligent being that decided to put organisms together in the way that they are. It's that there's a kind of internal teleology. There's something analogous in some way to a mind or to an agent who acts in light of a goal. There's something analogous to that that's going on when, say, an embryo develops into an adult organism. And so obviously, when we talk about analogy, there's going to be some respects in which these two things are alike and some in which they're different. And so we'll have to, go through this later on, to see to what extent is this teleology in the case of living beings different from, goal-directedness in a person. And obviously, one key difference is this sort of like representational element that, if you're a person building a house, you might have like a diagram or blueprint or whatever that you draw first. So you have a sort of representation of the end state that you want, or even if you don't have actual physical drawing, you still presumably have some sort of even vague image of what is the goal that you're trying to achieve, and then you sort of guide your behavior using that image. But of course, we have no reason to think that an acorn has like an image of the adult oak tree it's trying to become, sort of floating before its quasi-mind, whatever exactly we want to call it. So yeah, if we're thinking of the acorn's development as teleological, we have to understand that goal-directedness in a different way than we would understand a person building a house as being goal-directed. Okay, so yeah, let's pick up on the from the beginning of chapter 4, please.
I can read. Chapter 4, The Contradictions of Biological Anti-Finalism. We can rediscover the preceding result directly without even invoking the impossibility of separating the external circuit and the internal circuit in biopsychal activity. Just as it is contradictory to quote-unquote signify that there is no sense, or to have as our end the proof that there is no end, or to defend the truth of a thesis that reducing everything to pure causes a tergo employs the word quote-unquote truth. In short, just as there are internal contradictions in anti-finalism when it bears on conscious human activity, so there are internal contradictions in biological finalism, even when biological facts are considered objective. In some sense, these objective contradictions are incarnated in the facts. They do not result, as in the first case, from the conflict between the form of an assertion and its content. To grasp the distinction, let us reflect on two kinds of objections that can be raised against an epiphenomenalist who maintains this curious theory. Consciousness is an ineffective glimmer that accompanies autonomously on nervous processes. 1. We can respond with the same argument we examined in the first chapter, quote, because you are a pure machine, your assertions cannot be true. 2. We can also raise another objection. For example, quote, how could a being in whom consciousness is an ineffective pure accompaniment have invented anesthetics? Unquote. In this case, the contradiction is incarnated acts. We shall now examine the contradictions of the second. They are as effective against the anti-finalist thesis as the pure logical contradiction of first kind. A. What is so shocking to every unprejudiced mind about this consequence of epiphenomenalism, the unconscious invention of anesthetics? Let us represent with two parallel lines the nervous process in a continuous and solid line, and the epiphenomenal consciousness in a discontinuous and dotted line. So he's referring to this figure 6, where there's 3 lines. One has arrows running left to right, one is a solid line above that, the other is dotted lines that are segmented. Continuous line thus represents a succession of causes acting on one another step by step. The dotted line cannot effectively act on the solid, but the human invention of anesthetics presupposes that the unpleasant consciousness induced human beings to seek the means to suppress it. If, according to the hypothesis, the unpleasant consciousness is not effective, how could it be at the origin of an action? And how could a chain of pure causality manage to escape this unpleasant consciousness? We encounter a similar situation in all cases where the living organism uses or seems to use a game of chance. And these cases are numerous. The most striking is the mechanism of recombination of genes in sexual reproduction. Biologists unanimously recognize its great significance alongside mutation in the life and evolution of species. Darlington recently showed the advantage of the various mechanisms of crossing over, of delayed meiosis, and of the reduction in the diploid phase in metazoans for the plasticity of the species. Another mechanism is the one through which sex determination takes place. One of the two gametes is heterogametic. There are 2 kinds of eggs or 2 kinds of spermatozoids, depending on the species. Sex is thus determined by a game of heads or tails, which ensures the approximate numerical equality of the 2 sexes according to the laws of chance. If the organism as a whole is the result of pure causes devoid of active finality, if it is the outcome of a pure automatic sort of fortuitous variations, then we have to interpret the fact by saying that chance fabricates a game of chance. This contradiction is just as striking as the earlier one, quote, ineffective consciousness seeking to suppress consciousness, unquote. In fact, in conscious activity, the use of chance is by definition always desired. It is always a voluntary renunciation of a voluntary choice. One plays heads or tails, or one draws lots to avoid every bias and every implicit influence of habit, which would risk engendering an inadvertent asymmetry. By using a die, consciousness chooses not to choose. It deliberately suppresses its own action, just as when one asks for anesthesia before a surgical operation. Anti-finalism in biology must then confront this curious consequence. Chance establishes a game of chance to suppress the action of a finalist direction that, according to the theory, does not exist. Yeah, I thought that some of his arguments in this chapter later on were effective. Maybe I just don't understand exactly what he's arguing here, but it doesn't seem, like contradictory to me to see sexuation as happening with like a 50-50-ish probability, that itself resulting from evolutionary mechanism seems less incoherent to me than a mechanistic interpretation of some of the like elaborate camouflage behaviors he discusses later.
Yeah, maybe we can start with the bit about games of chance. Yeah, I think it's maybe separating that from the broader argument for the moment. So I think the games of chance bit is interesting because or not just games of chance, but also things like using a coin toss to make a decision. So in in many sports, for example, like one side of the game has to have the ball at the beginning, but there's maybe a certain advantage to having the ball, and so you want to ensure that there's no sort of favoritism about one team having it to start with or not. And so in this situation, I think pretty much universally, a coin toss is the means of choosing which team gets the ball to start with. And what the coin toss does, of course, is to remove the possibility, discounting, the possibility of some sort of weighted coin, or the referee like mastering the technique of flipping the coin in such a way that one side comes up. Assuming it's a fair coin toss, it eliminates the possibility of favoritism in ensuring that one side gets the ball first. And so it's kind of a strange sort of conceptual structure in the sense that you are intentionally removing intention from the selection of the team that gets the ball first. And it suggests at least that the absence of intentionality or the absence of a sort of goal directedness is not sort of the default state of the way humans act, I guess you could say. That because we have to adopt this sort of peculiar ritual of flipping a coin to sort of remove the possibility of intention from this behavior or from this decision of selecting one team to get the ball first. It at least suggests that maybe something like goal directedness is the default, and it's only in certain conditions that we can we have to sort of set things up in such a way as to block the goal directedness from happening or from being exercised. And so I think maybe the broader argument is sort of taking that to be the case, not just in the case of human action, but more generally. And so he's pointing to things like this crossing over in sexual reproduction of biological organisms, for example, as kind of a similar kind of workaround, I guess you could say, for living organisms to sort of block the sort of direct the direct goal directedness, I guess you could say, and sort of allow for this chance element to, of course, this is all done with a different sort of functionality at a sort of higher order, at a meta level, because all these elements like crossing over that introduce more genetic variation, help the evolutionary process to find variants that are more likely to be fit. But yeah, so maybe when he describes this as a contradiction, it's maybe too strong, but you could say that these examples sort of illustrate or at least suggest this idea that like chance or this sort of unintentional or undirected, unteleological process is a kind of exceptional case that has to be like brought about by a specific kind of arrangement, like for humans, things like flipping a coin, rolling dice, or whatever. And then in the case of living beings, there are these other sort of processes like crossing over that sort of scramble the genetics to some extent to try to like introduce more variation into the evolutionary process. Yeah, so it's like a kind of the default state is teleology, and then there's certain cases where some other mechanism or some other device is brought in to sort of block that from happening and give a place for chance in whatever that process is. So Organelles has put a comment in the chat here. So something like an intentional game of chance allows for us to overcome an unintended rote mechanistic pattern in behavior. Yeah, so maybe a good example of this is in like a standardized test situation where you have like multiple choice answers, say like A through D. Often even in like a relatively small setting, like just one classroom, often people will use some sort of computer program to randomize the answer. Like if you as the professor or a teacher are setting up all the answers, every single answer is A, the students will probably catch on to that pattern pretty quickly. Or if you go, the first one is A, the second one is B, etc. Like if you have some sort of pattern in your answers, then students will figure that out. Or if you just sort of select them, if you try just sort of manually to randomize the answers, there's a good chance that you won't sort of reach a purely random result. Like maybe you have 30% answer D instead of 25 or whatever. Like there'd be sort of a disproportionate number of questions in which one of those answers is correct, as opposed to having each be sort of equally likely in each answer. And so in this case, you as the person creating this test, are likely to produce a kind of pattern that the student could figure out, even if you're trying not to. And so you sort of delegate your your task of putting the correct answer or assigning a letter to the correct answer. You delegate that task to this computer program to sort of prevent yourself from unintentionally introducing a pattern. And even, and maybe just as an aside here, but like the computer program that randomizes the answers, like computers, of course, are deterministic machines. Even though sometimes it doesn't seem like that, where something that worked just fine, 10 minutes ago suddenly doesn't work. But yeah, in general, a computer, if you have the exact same input state and run the exact same process, you should get the exact same output. It's just that there are so many possible input states that it's often hard to determine which one you actually are in. But yeah, so if you try to get a random number or random assignment of letters to the correct answers on a computer, it's actually a kind of pseudo random process. Often what they use is checking sort of the last digits on the timestamp of the computer, so that you have a clock on the computer that's running in milliseconds or some very small time interval, and it uses these last digits, which are not really very meaningful for most purposes. It doesn't really matter if this was 124 milliseconds or 423 milliseconds or whatever, but it uses those last digits to sort of simulate random numbers. Yeah, but then there's all kinds of there are certain situations where, for cryptographic purposes, if you sort of know what kind of device the process is being run on, and then you can sort of take other information to figure out the timestamps and use that to sort of reverse engineer what the original data that was supposed to be in because it's the fact that this process is not actually random but sort of simulating randomness allows you to sort of undo the encryption. So yeah, there's a lot of, so in this case, when you encrypt something, you're trying to make the pattern that is visible in the sort of initial message, in the unencrypted message, you're trying to obscure that pattern, make it so that an unwanted recipient can't detect whatever the pattern in the message is. But yeah, there's all these very tricky ways that you are sort of unintentionally introducing patterns that allow for that original pattern to be detected. So yeah, it's often, yeah, even basically the whole field of cryptography kind of is an example of what he is talking about here. The fact that you have to take these sometimes extremely elaborate measures to prevent your message from conveying information. It already sort of suggests that producing randomness is something that has to be brought about by some sort of dedicated process. It's not just sort of the default state of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, as I understand this part here, it's sort of the same thing he's been doing throughout, which is that if we allow for our intentional use of chance at our behavioral level, then we have to assume that there was some intention or purpose for evolution to introduce it into sex determination as well. That wasn't just sort of random or happenstance.
Yeah, so maybe describing it in terms of evolution having a purpose might be a bit misleading, because of course evolution is not an agent that decides to do things for a certain reason in the way that, say, a person would, and that would be sort of the intelligent design or creationist sort of presentation of the phenomenon. But I guess
Yeah, and I don't want to imply that I mean it in that way at all. That's
yeah, of course, yeah, just for sort of clarification purposes. So I think maybe the way he would kind of present it here is that if we can identify certain processes, specific processes in biological organisms that have this sort of randomization role, in the same way that flipping a coin or rolling dice has a randomization role in human behavior. The fact that we can sort of point to these specific processes as having this randomization function, at least suggests, or to some extent, it implies that there's a difference between these randomizing processes in biological organisms and other processes which don't have this randomization character. In the case of human behavior, of course, we can like there's a big difference between, someone flipping a coin to make a decision and someone, weighing up the pros and cons and choosing one option over the others to make the decision. These are two, even if the outcome is selecting the same option, like if we made the rules of, whatever sport in such a way that the referee would, like, I don't know, evaluate which team has the nicer uniform and give them the ball first, that would be a very different way of, arranging for the sport to be played than if we just use a coin toss. So the fact that we can sort of point to certain processes, either in human actions or in the case of living beings, if we can point to certain ones and say these are the randomizing ones, then we're sort of presupposing that other processes are not randomizing in the same sense. Even if you maybe have some like more sort of fundamental story about how ultimately chance is sort of responsible for, say, like the evolution of living beings that brings about all these other processes, we still have to be able to say that some of these have this more sort of directly chance character, and others maybe are indirectly due to chance through this sort of evolutionary filter or something like that. But we still have to be able to point to some processes as randomizing and other ones as not randomizing in the same sense. And I think this was maybe connected to his more general distinction that we saw in the cybernetics book between like true forms, which have this teleological structure, and then aggregates that don't have a teleological structure. So what makes something an aggregate is in part, or part of what it is to be an aggregate is simply to be sort of distributed in a chance way. So like, the sort of classic examples are a pile of sand, or a bunch of water molecules flowing through a pipe. For the pile of sand, there's no sort of specific reason, there's no purpose or function for this grain of sand to be in this part of the pile and not in some other part. It's just, it's sort of there might be, so maybe this pile of sand is deposited by, say, like wind, blowing particles around and sort of depositing them in a certain way. And there's going to be a certain probability for any grain of sand in that region that it will be blown by the wind onto this pile. And obviously this will not be a purely random probability, because certain grains of sand are more likely to land in the pile than others, depending on where they are relative to the pile. But it's still, there's no sort of there's nothing intrinsic to the pile of sand that determines where the grains end up. And of course, this is very different than a living being, where the liver cells and neurons and muscle cells are not just sort of distributed around the body by some, even a biased sort of random process where there's like higher chance or whatever, but they're actually produced and made to stay in a certain place. And if they don't, that's a very bad situation for the organism. That's what we call cancer. So the organism is structured in a way that each of these different types of cell is in a certain part of the body, and this is sort of like a result of the organism being a true form. It's something that has a structure and where it does matter that one cell is in a certain place and not another. And so this is a kind of non-chance or anti-chance development. And so for Ruyer, the true forms are the sort of more fundamental entities, because of course for him subatomic particles and so on are also true forms, and then this like chance occurs only as a result of these sort of aggregate collections of true forms, like the pile of sand. And then there are these different processes, which he uses this nice term pipes to describe. Like he's sort of extending this from the case of like hydrological processes, where you use a pipe to ensure that water flows in a certain direction and not others. But in general, you have these different sort of mechanisms that ensure that what would be a pure chance distribution instead is distributed in one sort of region of the probability space, and not others. This sort of opposition between chance and teleology is sort of like one of the central concepts of his whole metaphysics, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I like how you put it there at the end, sort of weighting probabilities or the probability space.
Yeah, so like the more sort of familiar, I guess, probabilistic processes that we're familiar with, like flipping a coin or rolling dice, are normally set up to be unbiased in the sense that when you flip a coin, either heads or tails should be equally likely to occur. But this, of course, is not the only sort of probabilistic situation. You could have a coin that is, let's say, comes up heads 60% of the time and tails 40% of the time. And so this is still a sort of chance operation. It's just not it's not equal probabilities. Of course, if you wanted to use this coin toss, this weighted coin to decide which team gets the ball in a game, that would not be like a sort of fair decision in the way that the rules of most sports would intend. But maybe there's some other process where it does make sense to have like a 60-40 distribution of chance. Yeah, and there's all kinds of this has to do all like there's a whole, of course, discipline of statistics where you sometimes would use say like a weighted average to sort of calculate an aggregate statistic for some population of entities of some kind. So yeah, the fact that you have sort of weighting or biasing and rather than an equal distribution among all the possibilities is not sort of doesn't negate the sort of chance character of the situation. And so this he wants to distinguish this from like the teleological case is not sort of reducible just to a weighted or biased chance setup. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Forget do we Angus, did you read the section or the paragraph beginning with C, with the letter C?
I think we're at B.
Oh, okay, yes, sorry. Yes, that's right. Okay. Organelles, would you like to read from the letter B on page 25?
B. The regulation of metabolism or of the various metabolism the organism, or more generally, regulation of internal chemistry presents with another contradiction type. According to the extremist anti-finalist hypothesis formulated by Rabot, among others, it is metabolism, along with the environment, that is the sole cause of the organism's structure. This structure is not adaptive in the strict sense, is arbitrary. Selection confines itself to eliminating the worst. Many biologists who do not share Rabot's generalizing dogmatism adopt at bottom the same point of view. It does nothing more than coherently express the very principle of. We have already demonstrated the absurdity of this thesis when it is extended, in conformity with its logic, to the psychic productions of the humans who express it. We could have also argued by relying on the intimate connections between external circuit and internal circuit. A man who intoxicates himself modifies his own internal environment by exploring an external circuit that passes through a whole social technology. Alcohol is an, quote, internal secretion, unquote, of human society, just as adrenaline is an individual organic secretion produced by organic technology. On the other hand, a man who has a drink of alcohol seeks, for instance, to muster courage for a difficult task. He foresees what his organic and psychological state will become after the sought-after libation, and thus clearly shows that, in the inseparable organism external action assemblage, something completely escapes the temporal succession of various states of the internal environment. Because this something uses it as a means, and even eventually, as in the preceding example of anesthesia or the game of chance, to momentarily suppress its own autonomy. According to Cannon, the organism proceeds in the same way when an emergency system comes into play in emotion, and a hypersecretion of adrenaline increases muscular power, arrests digestion, accelerates the movements of the heart, and so forth. But if, by hypothesis, the physicochemical metabolism is the general cause of the organic structure, we have to conclude that it is the organic metabolism that establishes the complicated system destined to control it. Oh, I'll stop here. So basically, as I understand this part, I mean, again, he's just kind of setting up the absurdity of this kind of complicated system blindly setting up all these mechanisms for its own control. I also I like the way he does this throughout the book, kind of setting up these concentric circles in which things happen. So here comparing the external environment, or like the social functions that lead to alcohol production, and the consumption of alcohol production is the same as sort of your fight or flight system.
Yeah, so I think this is again the same type of sort of analogy argument, in the sense that the sort of external process through which we have a very complicated social sort of social and technical system that produces alcohol, distributes it around the world, makes it available to the person if they give money in exchange, etc. All this stuff. This whole system is a sort of roundabout way by means of which the person can change their blood chemistry and then change their sort of dispositions to behave in certain ways. This is analogous, or this is just a sort of externalization in some sense of the process within the person, within their body, of producing a certain hormone that also changes their dispositions to behave. So of course, we know things like adrenaline, that when you're in a situation of sort of stress or needing some kind of like immediate response, there's this release of adrenaline into the bloodstream, which has different physiological effects that allow for like a sort of short-term release of energy. And yeah, we talk about this fight or flight response. So you can sort of release the energy to prepare yourself to fight and protect yourself that way, or run away from whatever the danger is. And yeah, so here we have a sort of internal process within the organism where it releases these chemicals into its bloodstream and changes its blood chemistry, and then that has effects on its behavior. And we also have this social technical process by means of which certain organisms, namely humans, produce a chemical that changes their blood composition and changes their behavior. And so again, we're meant to sort of see these as analogous. The external circuit through the whole alcohol production industry and distribution and everything is sort of a more complicated and extensive sort of external version of the same type of process that happens within the body to produce and distribute chemicals that change the behavior of the organism. Yeah, so I think that's the general sort of pattern. He's going to be, I think, using a similar argument throughout a lot of the book. And I think maybe also it's worth pointing out here. So he talks about like how ingesting alcohol is obviously not something that just happens. Well, usually doesn't happen just by chance. Maybe you get punched from the wrong bowl or something. Maybe you were not intending to drink alcohol. But yeah, in general, the whole the production of alcohol, of course, is not something that just happens by chance. There are people who decide to buy these different materials and hire workers and lease space for a factory, et cetera, et cetera. All this stuff has to be done intentionally. And then the person who drinks the alcohol is normally doing it intentionally, and in some cases there's even sort of like a second degree intention, in the case that he's describing here, is where like you're sort of trying to get yourself in the right mindset to do something that maybe you're a little bit afraid to do, and you decide you're going to have a drink first that sort of reduces your inhibitions or makes it a little bit easier to get over that difficult task. Yeah, so in this case, you are sort of deliberately deciding to impair your faculties or your sort of more your everyday sort of like security, I guess, precautions that you would take. You sort of deliberately block those from taking effect by means of this complicated external system that allows you to change your own blood chemistry. And so if this is a kind of goal-directed process, then the case of the release of adrenaline into your bloodstream, we should also see that as goal-directed, though obviously again not in the sense that someone has decided in this has sort of depicted the goal state for themselves and then made a conscious decision to achieve that goal state.
Yeah, I thought this was a pretty good argument that metabolism itself, physicochemical metabolism, can't without more explain kind of the organism level decision to ingest some substance that affects the physicochemical metabolism in the pursuit of some goal, at that level of the organism. That seems pretty hard to refute. I guess you could, say that there are like nested feedback mechanisms, but it sort of seems like that would be kind of conceding Ruyer's point here, at least.
Yeah, I think like the alternative would have to be sort of like going the Dawkins route, I guess, and saying that the organism is essentially just a vehicle for the reproduction of the genes, and the genes are just this sort of chemical, the deoxyribonucleic acid, a strand of a DNA, or a segment of a DNA strand that has this reproducibility property. But yeah, I mean, we don't need to get into it too much, but there's a lot of problems with that sort of story. And for one, there's this sort of tendency to describe DNA as self-replicating, as a self-replicating molecule and so on, but that's actually not true because DNA by itself doesn't actually do anything. It just sort of sits there. It's only in the context of a cell that has all this other cellular machinery that it can take the DNA as a template to produce a new strand of DNA. And so, yeah, the DNA molecule is not itself sort of self-reproducing. It's the cell. The cell can reproduce the DNA, like it's easily copyable. It has a certain structure that makes it easy to produce new copies that are very close to the original, though not perfect copies. And then the cell as a whole is self-reproducing in the sense that it takes in nutrients, uses them to replace damaged parts and so on. It sustains itself in existence, and it uses the DNA, of course, in that process by using the segments of the DNA as templates to produce proteins. But yeah, so the Dawkins picture just is not like even just sort of at the level of empirical adequacy is just not a correct picture of how organisms work. But if you were to maybe, I don't know, I guess you could probably come up with a more sophisticated picture of how the organism is really just the result of some kind of mechanical process, in evolution, and it's all just sort of molecules bumping into each other, and it only looks like goal-directedness from our perspective. But yeah, it requires a lot of work to, I think, present a picture that along those lines that actually is even just sort of basically empirically adequate.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's what he's doing. At least in this early part of this book, exactly, as showing that if we're gonna make that assumption that it is just all just kind of blind, random, bumping into each other and chance, then we have to extend that all the way to human behavior as well. And in this paragraph, the manufacturing and distribution and consumption of alcohol, because I mean, where is the line between that versus the secretion of hormones that direct specific behaviors in response to other behaviors? I mean, no one's ever actually shown that line. And there's some hand waving that can occur, but throughout he shows it's all just hand waving and doesn't stand up, and you just have to rely on analogy, which I appreciate the argument. I think it's a strong argument. And going back to the DNA, I mean, it's there's a lot more to this, but there's a way to think about DNA, which I think is something that we're kind of moving towards, is more of just kind of like a highly manipulatable storage system, and that the cell has a lot of mechanisms through which it can, I hesitate to use this word intention, but again, like it's built into the system that the cell can manipulate the DNA in multiple various ways, at the level of switching nucleotides to how it's, to transcription, to translation, and all this stuff. So it's almost like DNA is the means through which the cell is creative, and all of this creativity happens. And the DNA is not the creative agent at all. It is the object of creativity, not the subject.
Yeah, there's a biologist whose name I can't remember at the moment, but who has described DNA as sort of like the memory of the cell in the same way that you have memory on your computer. So of course your laptop or your phone or whatever has a memory that you can use, for example, to store a program or say like a spreadsheet or whatever. But if you don't actually do anything, like if you don't run a program, it just sits there as a bunch of magnetized regions on a disk or something. It's not really doing anything. So of course, having memory available is an essential element to making a computer run. But on its own, it doesn't compute anything. And so yeah, like in the same way that you have DNA in a cell serves as a sort of template to produce different proteins, but that which protein to produce when is not something that is sort of determined by the DNA itself. Of course, it's this much more complicated process between all the different organelles within the cell, the concentration of the different chemicals, etc. That sort of upregulates and downregulates different production of different proteins depending on all kinds of extremely complicated combinations of circumstances, and often these like there's one I think it's no I can't remember, it might be E. coli, I can't remember which one. Anyway, there's one sort of bacterium that can metabolize different substances, as I think it's lactose or glucose if I remember correctly. But of course it requires different biochemical machinery to perform these kinds of metabolism, and so it sort of responds to the concentration of these different chemicals in its environment to sort of switch from one metabolic pathway to another. And of course, from a sort of functional perspective, this makes perfect sense that like if there's a lot of input A, then it makes sense to use A, and if there's a lot of input B, it makes sense to use B. But yeah, it's not sort of as simple as a kind of mechanical input output diagram might suggest, because if I remember correctly, they also respond. They aren't just responding to like the level at a certain moment of the chemicals, but also sort of like the change over time. Like if the concentration is decreasing of a certain chemical, it will switch, or vice versa. Yeah, so a lot of these, and this of course, we don't think of bacteria as like extremely sort of sophisticated organisms. They often have much smaller chromosomes than like mammals do, for example. But they're still sort of making these flexible sort of changes in their functioning based on different circumstances, and that part of that change in functioning has to do with making use of their DNA in different ways to produce different proteins and bring about these different metabolic processes. But yeah, I think coming back to your point about like the sort of inability to draw sort of a principled line, saying that on this side we have intentions, on humans that are doing things for a reason or for a purpose, and then on this other side of the line, it's just all molecules bumping into each other obviously in complicated ways, but in principle just sort of blind mechanism. And I think so someone like Dawkins maybe does try to sort of bite the bullet and say, like he describes humans and other animals as just sort of robots being run by the genes and sort of made to do things, for the sake of ensuring that genes reproduce themselves. And this is sort of connected into the or at least is along the same lines as some of the like evolutionary psychology stuff that tries to explain a lot of human behavior in terms of like this sort of often sort of fantasized, not really very well supported ideas about like what early human evolution would have been like, and that it often just so happens that all the sort of political arrangements that the person writing the book likes are the ones that are supposedly natural to humans. Countries have militaries because of like aggression being selected for in early human evolution or whatever. And I mean, it's clear that human behavior today is not like sort of completely independent of, say, early human evolutionary pressures that are dispositions to behave in certain ways, are yeah, have connections to early human evolution. Like I mean, one very obvious case is sexual behavior is obviously not independent of biological reproduction, though it's obviously not perfectly aligned with it either. Um, um, but of course, there's no sort of like gene for building a factory to produce beer. Yeah, to have beer at lunch. Yeah, there's no gene that says that makes humans, build alcohol production facilities and distribute, the alcohol around the world by airplane and so on. Like, there's all kinds of things, all these sort of social technical arrangements that we have, that even for something that seems maybe not super important, like producing alcohol. This is something that is a specific, historical development that certain societies in human history engaged in, and others did not. And so, trying to sort of explain this in terms of like the evolutionary pressures that early hominids would have faced, on the savannah or whatever, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's almost like some of these dominant scientific dogmas, at least in biology, have been sort of backfit to explain our social or material conditions. I mean, like for something like the selfish gene, that was just that's a book. There's not really much experimental evidence, but for so many people and so many scientists, it's there's that dogmatic adherence to it as this must be the way it is. But I mean, and that's why I like this book so much, because when you really start breaking these things down, you can see just really how absurd they are.
Yeah, I mean Dawkins specifically, I think he did maybe like biology grad school if I remember correctly, but then he never really worked as a biologist afterwards. Like he's a popular writer, doing talking about biology, but he hasn't sort of worked as a biologist, publishing peer-reviewed papers and so on, at least for several decades, if ever. I'm not sure he ever did that. Yeah, so like most of his I mean, it's not to say that that's like a bad thing that you have to publish in biology journals to be able to talk about biology. But it's just that it's not the case that he's sort of done a lot of biological studies, and then sort of drawn lessons from them and sort of presented that to the public. It's that he's like come up with these ideas that are obviously connected to biological research, but are not sort of directly drawn from them, and then he's sort of presenting that to the public, and that also, of course, sort of feeds back into the way that other biologists think about what they're doing, because they're not sort of separated off from the general public understanding of biology either.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always this big leap from we like the experimental evidence. What is that? I mean, there's so much that even goes into that, but really, the selfish gene is a model. Like, I mean, people will say, well, it's there's experimental evidence, but you can interpret experiments in hundreds of different ways, and you can build these stories however you want to build them at some level. And especially if you're given free reign to kind of build the story or the model to fit, a certain dominant social system or something, then it's like, oh well, this explanation makes sense. I mean, it's like most of evolutionary psychology, where it's just so stories, but it's a little more subtle at when you're talking about actually biology. But it's in a lot of ways it's similar.
Yeah, so the evolutionary psychology is one of the sort of most egregious examples of this, where it's like you just sort of make a sort of observation, a supposed observation about the way societies work today, and then you sort of extrapolate, what sort of evolutionary pressures, in early hominid evolution would explain this, the existence of this sort of set of behaviors that humans engage in today, and then you sort of infer that therefore, that was what sort of brought about these behaviors, and the sort of like corollary is usually that, okay, because these behaviors are supposedly this, natural or like ingrained in human nature or whatever, therefore we can't undo racism or something like that, because it's like sort of natural into human beings. Um, yeah, so there's obviously like pretty much every step of that reasoning is very questionable. In other domains, there's a lot less maybe I could say motivated reasoning of like trying to reach a certain conclusion. But there's also been criticism within philosophy of biology of what's sometimes called adaptationism, which would be like I mean, it's not a position that anyone I think would sort of explicitly adopt and say that I am an adaptationist, but like it's the sort of assumption that every sort of aspect or every trait of an organism is a result of selection and is adapted, has a certain evolutionary function. And there's this famous paper from Stephen Gould and Richard Lewontin about the paper I think is the Spandrels of San Marco. I can't remember the exact title, but anyway, it's talking about so they adopt this term from architecture, a spandrel, and so a spandrel is sort of the space that emerges as you sort of build arches next to each other. There's sort of like a curved triangular space between the arches, if you can sort of picture that. And of course, there's no like the architect did not sort of design the building to have these curved triangular spaces. It's just that they designed it with arches, and then the shape between the arches has this form. So there's no sort of purpose to the spandrel. The spandrel is not like something that was intended as such. It's just sort of the byproduct of the arches which were intended. And so they argue in that paper that there's probably many attributes of organisms that are also sort of not adaptations in any sense. They aren't for something. They weren't selected for something. It's just that as a sort of byproduct of other attributes that were selected for, and all the sort of complicated biological machinery that has to be developed to perform a certain function. It also has some other effect that has no evolutionary relevance. It just sort of it is kind of a byproduct of something else that arose through an evolutionary process. And so, yeah, so the idea is that like we shouldn't, just because we find some trait in an organism, we can't assume that trait was selected for. It could very well just be a byproduct of some other selective process, or the interaction between other processes that were selected for, and that brings about this result just sort of without any sort of selection for that result. Yeah, and so Angus has put in the chat here the reference to this the problem of sort of gradualism in evolution, where there are many traits of organisms that are hard to understand as having developed gradually, in the sense that like one small mutation sort of pointed slightly towards, took the organism from point A and directed it, a little bit further towards point B, and then after many such steps, you sort of arrive at this end state, which is the one we observe today. And so I think early examples of this, I think even Darwin talks about this, is a vertebrate eye, for example, is obviously a very complicated organ, many different parts. You have a lens, and you have to have muscles that can control the way that the lens accommodates to incoming images, and you have to have a retina. Like all these different things all have to be there for the eye to even really be doing anything. And it's hard to see how it's hard to see how an organism would say like develop a lens if they didn't already have a retina. But the retina is also not particularly useful if you don't have a lens. So it seems like there's a sort of bootstrapping problem where it's like, how do you even get the process of evolving an eye started if like each part sort of presupposes all the other parts? Yeah, and I think so in some cases you some of the things that maybe at first seem very difficult to understand, I think there has been more research that has sort of uncovered some of these things. So like, yeah, in the case of eyes, there are many organisms still existing today, and likely in much earlier times that have not eyes but just sort of photosynthetic patches or photosensitive patches. So like I think a lot of like organisms that live in like a seabed environment, they have like a photosensitive patch, which essentially just determines like, is my body exposed to light coming from above? And if so, I'm going to burrow down into the sand to hide. And so here this photosensitive patch is not an eye, it's not sort of resolving an image, it's just detecting, is light striking this portion of the skin. And this is sort of like a very early stage of what ends up becoming an eye, and then you can, yeah, it takes it would take many very careful analyses of various fossils and existing organisms to try to find how this very simple photosensitive patch ends up becoming the very differentiated eye that we see in vertebrates. But yeah, in principle, the idea is that you just find intermediate steps that sort of fill in all these stages. But yeah, in general, the fact that there is some sort of attribute in an organism doesn't necessarily mean that it was adapted for. In the case of the vertebrate eye, because it is so sort of complicated, it's hard to imagine that it was sort of just an accidental byproduct of other processes. But it could be that some step along the path that led to the production of an eye was itself this sort of spandrel, where it wasn't that lenses, eyes with lenses were selected for, but something like a lens developed as a result of some other process, and then later that lens plus photosensitive skin patch sort of combination turned out to be advantageous to those organisms in a different environment that where it had never existed before, and then that sort of gets the adaptation pathway going where better and better eyes are selected for. But yeah, so like often the story is very complicated. There's like things that are selected for, things that are just the result of other processes, and then the organism maybe changes its environment, it migrates, or the environment changes, and then something that was sort of purely an accidental result of other processes at first now becomes relevant to selection, and so yeah, the whole organ might change its function as a result of a new environment that the organism finds itself in. And the case of eyes is also especially interesting because we have vertebrates have these eyes with very complicated and seemingly very sort of mutually presupposing elements that a lens is not useful unless you have a retina, and vice versa. And you also have mollusks that develop an almost identical eye like structure, like they have a lens and a retina, sort of, or things that are analogous to each of these elements in the eye, in say like an octopus or a snail. But of course, like our most recent common ancestor with these organisms was like a tiny sort of worm-like thing that probably had photosensitive patches, but nothing resembling an eye. And that yet, after hundreds of millions of years, these two extremely divergent strands of animal existence evolve eyes that are like very similar in structure. Yeah, and in terms of the developmental history, like in the individual organism, the pathway is different. Yeah, so human or vertebrate eyes are sort of extrusions from the brain, whereas yeah, in mollusks it's like sort of the opposite. It's the skin sort of forms the eye. But yeah, it's very striking that like you find these like extremely divergent branches of the sort of animal evolutionary history that develop almost identical like structures of eyes seemingly independently. Yeah, and this sort of like convergent evolution here is often, I think, taken to be an argument for adaptation as being sort of the explanation, because it seems it would be very surprising if these sort of like sort of chance encounters of other processes and spandrels and so on resulted in this complicated eye being developed not once but twice with like the same kind of structure or very similar structure in these very divergent lineages. Yeah, so it seems like at least part of the explanation has to be that there is some similar selective pressures that are sort of pushing for the development of this eye structure in both cases. But yeah, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only part of the story. And yeah, probably there are other cases where structures or attributes of organisms are not necessarily the result of selection and adaptation.
I can read the next section.
Yeah, let's read one more and then we can wrap up.
C. If instead of dubious channels, we were to clearly see on the surface of Mars the geometric construction demonstrates Pythagoras' theorem, the hypothesis of intelligent Martians would find few detractors. For this construction would reveal that the Martians possess a true Possession of a truth is obviously a whole other thing than automatic obedience to a law. No one doubts that real phenomena on Mars obey the laws of gravity or mechanics, but a proof of the possession and use of these laws by Mars's inhabitants would be absolutely quote-unquote sensational. Between these two orders of facts, there is the same difference as between, quote, following the laws of chance and, quote, inventing a game of chance, unquote, or between, quote-unquote, undergoing alcoholic fermentation and, quote-unquote, drinking alcohol to muster courage. All of these contradictions are quote-unquote isomorphic. In these cases, it would be contradictory to explain the second worst. Animal camouflage, as we will see, is the most beautiful instance of this type of contradiction. We know that Gestalt theory claims to apply its interpretations of forms not only to psychology but also to biology. Wertheimer and Kafka claim to resolve in psychology and biology what Kafka calls the positivism-vitalism dilemma. That is, the dilemma of, quote, causal explanation, unquote, and, quote, explanation by sense and value. Unquote. Kohler tried to show that his principles explain the regulations after lesion or after experimental excision in the course of embryogenesis. The theses of quote-unquote Gestaltists have influenced biologists considerably and in every domain, from neurology, Goldstein, to embryology, Dahlke. The insufficiency of the thus generalized Gestalt theory is obvious in the presence of facts that experimental embryology is firmly established. But the facts of animal camouflage, or the opposite and analogous facts of quote-unquote animal publicity, aposemantic coloration of animals who want to alert predators or enemies to their identity, show not merely its insufficiency but its contradictory nature, by virtue of the principle that the same organic structure cannot be deemed at once to obey the laws of Gestalt theory and to use these laws to conceal or announce itself. An organism that uses the laws of Gestalt cannot be explained by these very laws. This contradiction would be equivalent to saying that Newton's discovery of the laws of gravitation had as its sufficient cause the fact that Newton's body underwent terrestrial attraction. In his great work, Adaptive Coloration in Animals, Hugh B. Cott follows by and large the outline of a treatise on camouflage or on public display, which seems to be inspired by the well-known laws of Gestalt psychology on the perception of forms, laws of segregation and grouping, laws of the good continuation of lines or movements, laws of pregnant forms, laws of figure and ground, laws of the figure's internal organization. By way of example, let us consider the facts that can be classified according to Kott's expression under the rubric disruptive coloration. For the observer, the unity of the object consists in its approximately continuous surface, surrounded by a contour that contrasts with the background. When this object is mobile, it cannot be concealed by a simple homochromy with an invariable ground, so it becomes necessary to break the color with violently contrasted strains, some of which have a chance of merging with the ground and some of which, though very visible, constitute a different configuration from that of the camouflaged object. This is precisely what we observe in a multitude of animals from the most diverse species, in butterflies, fish, frogs, reptiles, mammals, or the eggs of certain birds. In many cases, the organism refines this procedure by accentuating the contrast of tones between adjacent stains, skins of reptiles, frogs, Cardioglossa gracilis, I'm not sure what that is, fish, equus, lanceolatus, birds, pluvier, etc. All the camoufleurs know that the contrasted stains not only must disrupt the contours of the object, but have to be completely detached from the object's natural elements. A priori, it seems difficult for nature to apply this principle to an organism, whose various parts form natural anatomic and physiological wholes, than it is for the camoufleur painter to apply it to a tank. For instance, he can easily spread the stain by cutting the gun barrel, the dome, and the body of the tank. Moreover, biologists like Tyler have claimed to show that the color marks follow an anatomical base. In this way, the patterns of snakes would be tied back to the underlying bone structure, and the same would hold for the majority of the patterns of caterpillars or birds. But in fact, animal camouflage is most often as perfectly disconnected from the underlying anatomy as the most successful camouflage of an assault tank. In the fish Heniocus macrolepidatus, or in Dascylus arguanus, a dark short stain runs uninterruptedly along the whole body, covering the eye and bisecting dorsal, pelvic, and anal fins. Let's read this next short paragraph. In a whole host of frogs, butterflies, and grasshoppers, the camouflaging stains or bands are arranged in such a way that not only do they virtually shatter the unity of an organ or natural part of an organ, but when the animal is immobile, they optically fuse distinct organs thanks to their harmony. Yeah, I'm thinking about this argument that, Gestalt good forms can't be the reason for the production of these forms themselves by the organism. As I understand it, a lot of, although I don't really know how much, I know that some color patterns in, like animal skins can be produced by like reaction diffusion systems, which do seem to, admit of like physicochemical explanation. But in these figures, this figure of the fish, for instance, where there's this black streak that runs down the side of the fish and covers this lower fin. I don't know. I guess I don't know enough about how those systems work to know how these reaction diffusion systems interact with the anatomy of the animal, the extent to which that can be explained in physicochemical terms.
Yeah, there's this whole interesting field in biology of sort of the morphogenesis of patterns, things like stripes and spots and so on, that obviously many organisms in all sorts of domains have. And yeah, there's some interesting cases with like I think it's like mollusks that live sort of on the seafloor, like buried in the mud, that end up having stripes on them. And it seems very strange that like why would this organism that lives in relatively deep water that's already dark, and then on top of that is buried in the mud, why would it bother like developing stripes? And in that case, it does seem to be just sort of a result of these sort of biochemical processes where like just the sort of interaction of the concentrations of different chemicals brings about changes in the pigmentation, and there's no sort of like, this is an example of one of these sort of spandrel things where there's no adaptive significance of the stripes. They aren't sort of for anything. It just sort of happens to have stripes as a result of various processes interacting in a certain way. But there are also many organisms that have stripes that are adaptive in some sense. So like zebras would be like sort of the classic example, where if you just look at one zebra standing there like in the middle of a field or in a grassland or whatever, it doesn't look very camouflaged. But if you have a whole herd of zebras and that's how they sort of normally behave in the wild, if you have a herd of zebras, the stripes break up the outline of the body of each individual animal and make it very difficult to pick out where is the animal, which direction is it facing, and obviously that tells you which direction it's going to be moving in. So you just see all these like lines going every direction and moving around in this chaotic way. It's very confusing. And yeah, many other organisms, not necessarily in relation to like herd behavior, but they also have these sort of patterns that help to break up the outline of the body and make it harder for a predator to sort of spot the animal in the first place, and then secondly to identify its orientation and therefore what direction it's most likely to move in. And then yeah, so many of the examples on there's little drawings in the book, which of course the listeners will not be able to see, but of how this works. And I think the point here has to do with Angus has put a nice example of zebras, where it's like when you look at this herd of zebras, your eyes start to like do little circles in your head because it's very hard to pick out like one body from another. So this argument about the Gestalt theory. So the Gestalt theorists, of course, they had this sort of basic idea was that there are these certain good forms in perception, things like like a circle or a square or whatever that are sort of like the lowest tension states in perception. It's sort of like the kinds of forms that we want to see or that our perceptual apparatus is sort of directed towards. That's like the easiest thing to perceive. And they sort of compared this process of sort of landing on the good forms to physical processes of energy minimization. So things like I think the sort of standard example is the way that a bubble of soap, a soap bubble, has a spherical shape because it is minimizing because of the surface tension, it's minimizing the area of the surface enclosing a certain volume of air. And a sphere is the minimal surface to enclose a given volume. And so there's no sort of like direction or bubbles are obviously not selected through an evolutionary process. There's no sort of purpose for a spherical shape. It's just a result of this very simple sort of energy minimization process. And yeah, so they sort of took that to be took that as an analogy for the way that our visual perception will sort of land on forms like a circle as a sort of like the sort of minimal energy state or minimum tension state. And then, of course, the purpose of the camouflage example here is to point out that many of these organisms that are using camouflage, the reason the camouflage works is because it precisely like produces these sort of outlines that are very hard not to pay attention to, that don't correspond to the shape of the animal itself, to the body plan of the animal. So it's very hard to pick out like the outline of the animal's body, as opposed to watching or picking out the stripes of the zebra that go in a different direction. And so like the sort of lowest tension state that your visual perceptual apparatus lands on is like looking at these stripes that are completely in a different orientation than the outline of the body that you, as a predator, if you're hunting zebras, for example, would want to be able to see. And so the idea here, like the reason why this is like a sort of counterexample for the Gestalt account is that you like the if you're trying to explain how these stripes develop, you can't rely on this sort of purely physical tension minimization account to explain how these stripes develop actually to sort of exploit this energy minimization or this tension minimization happening in the predator's visual system. And so he compares this to like sort of trying to explain Newton's development of the theory of gravitation, as a gravitational process. Of course, it's not like Newton could only discover or develop a theory of gravitation because there was gravitation in the world, but the fact that the solar system is governed by gravitation doesn't result in anyone understanding gravitation or representing the solar system as gravitational. And so likewise in the case of the camouflage, the fact that say like a lion's visual system operates in accordance with these Gestalt principles doesn't explain how the zebra acquires or develops these stripes that sort of exploit the fact that the lion's visual system works that way. So it's clear that there's like there has to be sort of a two-layer explanation. Is that you first have to explain how the lion's visual system works, and then you have to explain how the zebra developed in such a way that it sort of takes advantage of how the lion's visual system works by sort of using these Gestalt principles against the lion. Yeah, and he also sort of points out, it's sort of in passing, but he points out that of course when humans are camouflaging, like in military context, when you put camouflage paint on a tank or something, you are also doing the same kind of thing. You're trying to so partly it's just selecting a color that sort of matches the background, a green color if it's like a jungle environment, or maybe a beige color in a desert environment or whatever. But it also is in such a way as to break up the outline of the tank or whatever it is. So it's not just that you want it to look the same as the background when it's not moving, but also you want it to sort of break up the outline to make it harder to pick out the vehicle against the background. I know that also reminds me just of a translation note that I put in the chat, but I should mention on the mic as well. So in the text, the translation given is it says stains for the French tâche. It would be better to use patches here. So a tâche can be translated as stain in certain contexts, like if you get tomato sauce on your shirt or whatever. But here patches is a better translation. So it's like colored patches on, say, like a fish or a frog or whatever, that help to camouflage the organism. That's what he's referring to. Okay, so yeah, I think we can leave it here for today. Thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for your contributions. I have to double check, but I think I might not be able to do next week. But yeah, I'll put something in the schedule channel about that to confirm.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you
Thank you,
next week or the week after, if that's how it works out.